And I think a lot of documentaries, some documentaries can be constructed that way and sort of written that way and structured. And that would be a fear, that things become a bit more consumer friendly. Documentaries should be challenging. It should be attacking. It should be questioning. It's not there to make you feel good.
So, welcome back, everybody, to a new episode of Eyeshot 50mm. And today we're sitting down with photographer Seamus Murphy. Seamus Murphy is a photographer who uses photography to unsettle simplifications without ever abandoning the ground of reality. His strength lies neither in the heroism of a photojournalist or documentary photography or in the purest form of a formalist, but it lies in its ability to stay close to the people he photographs and encounters. Seamus, thank you so much for being with me today, and welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
Please. And for everybody who's watching, I just want to leave a small message to keep liking and keep subscribing, because with just a very small click to you, it means the world for us. So we can already start, Seamus, and the very first question I have for you is, who is Seamus Murphy according to Seamus Murphy?
I don't know. I don't know. I often wonder. I'm Irish. I suppose that's the first thing I would say. And it's funny because I'm not a huge nationalist or anything, but I just feel very Irish. Maybe the travel has reinforced that. When I left Ireland in 1983, and I haven't lived there since, but I obviously have family there and I go there a lot and I work there and everything. But when I left Ireland, I went to America, and the one thing I wanted to avoid was Irish bars, Irish people in America, the diaspora, the Irish Americans. I wanted to get away from all that because I was actually getting away from Ireland. I grew up, Holy Catholic Ireland was a terrible place in my youth, and it's become a lot better. Great country now. And it was a great country then, but it had this terrible religious obsession and they had far too much power. And I wanted to get away from all that. And so I didn't want to go and be around Irish people. That was the whole point, was to get away from them and get away from myself. Anyway, I think, with that, and then coming back to London, because London was close to Ireland, but not quite Ireland. I've lived here ever since. I would say I'm Irish. I would also say photography is hugely important in my life. In some ways, it saved my life. I'm not a strategic careerist. Things that have happened have usually been through hard work, but not through any kind of great plan. I've mostly fallen into things, but always followed stuff that interested me. So photography is very important to me. Family, relationships, friends, all that stuff, the usual stuff. I'm a simple kind of person, actually. Simple things make me happy. Nature, being productively busy, having fun with friends. Simple guy, really.
I like that. I really like that. And I'm familiar with Ireland as well because I've got to know it pretty well in certain aspects. But what I wanted to ask you is that, as you said, you've spoken about growing up in Ireland with a country with a very strong awareness of history, religion, politics as well, and conflict. Do you think the environment where you've grown up has in some way influenced the way you see the world and consequently you do photography?
Yeah, I think it's this case with everyone. You may not be aware of it, but everything goes back to the influences you were as a child, your parents, the people around you, the people that bullied you, the people that you were friends with. The bad experiences, the good experiences. It all adds up to you. And what's amazing with me, I think, with photography, to me, is like any art, like any craft, like any activity, in a way, your personality is part of it. Any musician is playing the music the way they play it and the way they like it because of something inside themselves, which would come from their history and unknown influences. So definitely growing up in Ireland, when I think about Ireland now and growing up in Ireland, it's sort of this sort of smoky, swirly, memories, very fond memories, of a country that, was unrecognizable almost to the country that it is now. Although there's still that side to Ireland, which is wonderful. It's like London, London has changed so much since I got here, but it's still the London. It's still London. There's nowhere else like London. So Ireland's changed a lot, but it's still Ireland. There's no other place like Ireland. Like Ireland. There's no other place like Ireland, literally. But that all influenced me, and life was very, we played football in the streets, that kind of thing. I mean, it wasn't idyllic. Of course, you think back on it and everything is rosy. It wasn't, but I had a happy childhood, and the north of Ireland, Belfast, the Troubles were beginning when I was about 7 or 8. And it's funny, one of my first strongest memories is being with my parents and my cousins who used to come over from England, and we used to go to my grandfather's house in the south of Ireland. And it was an incredible month we would spend together, 3 families, and a huge row happening about the north of Ireland because the other cousins were living in England, and one of them was English, whereas the others were of Irish extraction. And there was a big, big fight about what was going on in the north, and these people were saying, it was good to send the British Army in and all that stuff. I remember that vividly. I was about 7 or 8. And then, into my very early teens, Northern Ireland, it was only 90 miles away, but it felt like a world away. And that had a big influence. And when Bloody Sunday happened, I remember being in school, and me and the other boys, I don't know where we learned it, were singing IRA songs, and the IRA were, they were a very complicated and controversial outfit, and they killed many people, innocent people. So, but I remember singing those songs, and it was perfectly normal, and no teacher was telling us not to, because that was the mood in Dublin at the time. So that all affected me, I'm sure.
In a way you see the world and you do photography, because it's very interesting. You've been often described as a documentary photographer, a filmmaker, a bookmaker as well, even a visual poet in some ways as well, and I'm very glad of this definition is connected to you. But for you, which of these definitions feels the closest to you, and which one maybe feels too small?
No, I'm a photographer. That's sort of, and I love the diversity of what I can do. If I decide tomorrow to learn about large format photography, which I've never done, I can do that, and nothing would stop me doing it. So I always try to veer away from artist or photographer or documentary photographer, war photographer, all these labels. I'm just a photographer. And, if I keep it that general, then I can do whatever I want. People will put labels on you. I've been labeled a war photographer, which is fine. I mean, I'm not running away from the places I've been and the incredible experiences I've had, and the interest I have in those places, and continue to travel to. But there are war photographers that are incredibly brave, incredibly know what's going on. Oftentimes when I'm in conflict zones, I don't know what the hell is going on. I usually travel. There's a great friend of mine who's a fantastic war correspondent, and he really is a war correspondent. And, whenever I travel with him, it's like having my own private security. He makes decisions. I'm very happy with those decisions because he knows what he's doing. I don't know what I'm doing most of the time in those places. But what I do is I connect with people, and that's what I'm there for. That's why I'm there. I'm not there to photograph soldiers shooting guns, although that's obviously important, and I'm not in any way disparaging that. But that's not why I go to these places. I go there to try and find out what's going on and find out the stories from people and visually represent it. So labels, yeah, people will put labels on you, and that's fine. I mean, it's probably a good thing in some ways. I mean, it was interesting hearing your introduction. I always like to hear what other people think about me, because I don't know what the hell I am, and I don't know what the hell I am as a photographer. So it's actually very useful to hear. Oh, is that right? Okay, that's interesting. And it helps actually, because photography is so bottomless. I find it harder and harder actually to take pictures. I really find it's more and more, because the more you take photographs and the more you learn from looking at your work and from life, there's so many choices, and those choices can be very complicated. When you start out, you want to photograph everything, and you're probably copying somebody, whether consciously or unconsciously. But then obviously you want to, you find your own voice, and then you want to be true to your voice. But what does that mean? When people say to things like, oh, that photograph's really you. I'm like, is it? I don't know. I mean, it's funny. But anyway, it's interesting because I wouldn't be able to make that description, but they can. So I find that very useful.
That's very interesting because you came to photography in a relatively, if I may say, organic way, rather almost self-built. Correct me if
Yes.
I'm wrong, of
Yes,
course,
that's right.
rather than a strict academic path or something like that. Do you think that that gave you freedom, or did it make the process harder?
I think it made the process longer. I mean, not maybe not the process, because as soon as I was able to make a living from photography, I was up and running, and it was a time in the '80s that you could make a living, and there was a lot of work, and so I just went for it, and I suppose if I'd had an academic background, I might have been more analytical about of what I was doing and what I was planning to do. But I just went from one thing to another and discovered things and discovered what I liked to do, what I could do, and always trying to sort of push the boundaries a bit. So I think it took me longer because to find myself, I got into photojournalism because that was a way to make a living. I needed to make a living. When I started out, it was in San Francisco where I was living for a few years. I learned how to print and develop my pictures. And I was buying books of secondhand books of photography. That's how I learned. And that was an amazing time because I was going out with the camera whenever I had free time. And I was just photographing what I wanted to photograph. And that was very free and amateurish. But I learned everything from that. And then I went through years of being a photojournalist and then going to conflict zones and doing news and doing features and learning about photojournalism, which I love doing and I still love doing when I get the chance. But I took on this project after I'd done quite a bit of Afghanistan and a little bit of Iraq. I just wanted to do America because I thought America was somewhere that was telling the world how to live and was
Yes.
beginning to sort of get involved in other people's politics. I mean, we're still reaping the rewards of that now. 9/11 and then the invasion in Iraq. So I wanted to look at America, and I thought America wasn't being really looked at so much. So I went to America and I started this project. And it's funny because I didn't go to Gaza. There was the withdrawal of Gaza was happening. I was supposed to go for the Sunday Times magazine, and I said I don't want to go. I want to do this. I want to start this project because if I don't start it now, I probably never will. And I said no to an assignment, which is very unusual. And I spent a month in America, and I came back, and I was looking at the pictures. I thought, what the hell have I done with the last month? This is rubbish. But after a while, looking at the pictures, I realized that I was actually reconnecting with that guy who started out with a camera. I was trying to forget the photojournalism and work visually, not thinking about deadlines, not thinking about editors. So
Interesting.
it took me that sort of long. I don't know if it would have been easier had I known what I was doing, but I didn't know what I was doing, and it took me whatever it took. And then that produces its own kind of work, though. So I don't think I would swap it, but I do recognize that it might have taken me longer to find my voice.
Interesting. That's very interesting. At this stage in your life, then, what do you think is the real center of your practice? You've lived so many different lives in a way, witnessing storytelling form, or I don't know, just trying to understand people. What would you say?
I've just been editing work, the most recent work I've done, which is in Kolkata and in India. There's going to be an exhibition in Delhi in August, and some of that will be new work from India, which is very exciting. And I was looking at that work, and it's color. The American work was also something where I deliberately, for personal, as a personal project, shot color. I would always shoot black and white before that. Whenever I had the chance professionally, I would always push people like, let me shoot black and white. And if I did anything for myself, it was always black and white. But this was going to be color for many, many reasons. I also thought just America. I was thinking of the Edward Hopper paintings. I was thinking of all the feelings that we have about America. And growing up as a child, watching television, and even though we were watching it in black and white, to me it was in color. So anyway, I got into color, and that started an approach that I'm really happy with and still excited by. I've done work in Ireland using the same way of taking pictures, color, and trying to be obviously not be journalistic, very intimate, but also quite outside,
Yeah.
an omniscient sort of eye. So that's still the thing that I'm at the moment is still driving me. Every so often I'll think, oh, I really want to go back to black and white. I must do something in black and white. And I will. But at the moment, the color in this way of working is really exciting and it's feeding me. So that's sort of where I'm at now. But I really could and will do some black and white work. In fact, there's something else I'm beginning to put together now, which I think it'll be actually a return to work I did in the late 90s. Interesting enough, of the old IRA, the guys who fought the British in Ireland between 1919 and 1921, they were incredibly old. The oldest was 105, and he was playing
Wow.
music when I photographed him. And the youngest was 97. They're all dead now, obviously. But I did these portraits of these guys and one woman and interviewed them. And I'm thinking about doing something now with that, connecting it to their legacy in Palestine and India. That's what I'm trying to put together. And that I think will be a lot of black and white.
Okay.
So different things, but the color in this kind of observational way, social documentary, I would call it satire in some ways. I'm trying to comment with a little bit of a, you know, point to it.
I
Um,
see that. Sure.
affection, but pointed. Yeah.
Now I wanna, because we'll touch very different topics in the course of this interview, and I wanna start by discussing journalism versus art, or more in general, like function versus form. So the first thing I wanted to ask is that I've read that you once said that in conflict zones, you work first as a journalist. So your task is more to record, to understand, to communicate. Can you first of all explain this to me and to everybody who's watching? And then following up on this, then I wanted to ask you, where does then art begin for you?
Mm, very hard. Very hard question. I think the journalism thing in conflict zones is that, usually, not always at all, but usually you're working for someone. There is an assignment. If you're somewhere very dangerous, you've probably, you wanted to go, but you had to find somebody to fund it. And so you have some kind of responsibility to them. So in that way, there's some information that's needed. And the information takes a certain form, and it's a recognizable form. And I suppose that's photojournalism, or documentary. And, that's why you're there. I mean, that's why you're there for them. And it's also pragmatically why you're there. So you've got a function to fulfill doing that. Also, sometimes in these places, you're lucky to get anything. You're lucky to get an image that works. So you're scrambling because it's dangerous and you can't go to certain places and you can't take pictures in certain areas. And even when you're with people, you have to secretly take photographs. So you're really, you're working as an information gatherer in some ways, recording. But of course, you're always framing, you're always composing, you're always using certain lenses, you're always, moving your body certain ways to get what you want. So you're still an artist in that way. So there's choices you make. But I suppose the other thing is that, in those situations, I will take photographs that are so-called artful, but they're just the pictures that I wanted to take. And, I did a book 10 years ago with PJ Harvey, the musician, called Hollow of the Hand. And pretty much all the work from Kosovo was never published. And yet I went there and I was on assignment and I photographed for all sorts of magazines, newspapers. They never used any of those pictures. They were the pictures I really wanted to publish because they were the most interesting pictures. And so I was taking those pictures without any knowledge that they would ever see the light of day. But I mean, I always thought that, I had to take those pictures because they were the strongest pictures. So you're working on many levels in a place like that. You're desperately trying to get something to justify the money they're paying you and the expenses and whatever being covered. But also you're there obviously to try to record the terrible stuff that's going on. So
Sure.
that's a duty, responsibility. But you're also doing it in your way. And then when you're doing that, you'll find something which will not be suitable for whatever they want, but it's your eye and you're doing that. If that answers your question, I don't know.
Yeah, it does. It does. And it actually connects then to what I wanted to ask you after, because then how do you personally navigate the tension between making an image that is formally strong, that needs to be taken for a certain media outlets to document what you're trying to document for them and for all of us in a way, and making one that remains, though, ethically honest, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, ethically honest, I think that's always huge question. But you can't sort of go into a day's work thinking about ethics all the time. In a way, it's operating on a parallel level. Of course, you might come across a situation where you have to make a very strong ethical decision. Do I walk around here with a camera? It might create more problems for the situation. It might also make certain people do certain things because they see a camera and they think, well, this is we should do something to. I mean, I've been in places where they'll fire off um, a rocket or something because the journalists have arrived, and that's terrible because what's happening on the other end. And of course, if the side that you're on fires, you're going to get fired back at. So it's always a weird thing. But then, of course,
Sure.
sometimes it makes a very good picture. So I've never encouraged anyone to do that, but I'm the first to take the picture if they do it. So it's a very murky area, and it's really down to the individual in the end. I mean, of course, you can teach ethics, and they should be taught and they should be discussed and debated, but in the end, it's going to be down to you. So it's a very fragile
Field. Yeah.
circumstance to be in.
Circumstances.
Yeah.
And is there a danger that the aesthetic power of a photograph can maybe soften the political reality of what is being shown then?
I just think, as a photographer, photographers will do the best they can, and doing the best they can is going to be to make the strongest image they know how to do. So in a way, it's sort of going against your very nature to try and be different. And if doing that in some way, I mean, of course, you might take pictures that you think will get published over pictures that will never get published, like I was doing. But I mean, I was doing that for my own personal reasons, and I thought they were the strongest pictures, but the publications didn't agree. They wanted the more obvious stuff. But you're trying, and you're also trying to get work published, and you're trying to get the story out. People often take risks to work with you and show you around, and they're desperate for you to tell their story because next week something terrible might happen. So they want that story recorded, and then I've been in places at times thinking, oh, is this the right thing to do? Should I be taking photographs? And then it's always the case where they'll say, it's great that you're here to take the pictures. The amount of times people say, don't take pictures of that. There's no delicacy when it comes to people's lives and wanting to show the truth. So you're sort of caught in this very, very fragile, volatile sort of minefield, and there you are with your little camera, and there's a terrible power to it as well.
Absolutely.
But I think also, I think really, it is extraordinary how little photographers abuse that, because I'm sure, it's possible to do all kinds of things. And I've rarely come across real, travesties of that kind of stuff going on, faking stuff. I mean, now with AI, God knows what's going to happen. But, you know, in the days of film and, you're out there somewhere, no one's around. You could do whatever you wanted to do. But it doesn't happen that much because it's just not the way it goes.
Interesting. Another very powerful and maybe brutally honest, but very interesting thing that you've said is that photographers sometimes are as thieves who rob, but do not always get back, now pay back. Apologies. That's again a brutal but very honest opinion. What were you trying to say with that?
I think I get frustrated sometimes with the amount of debate that goes on. Is it taking a picture or making a picture? Is it shooting a picture, which is like a gun? I just think it's all a bit. I think it's all a bit too much.
Yeah.
As I started out by saying, I'm a simple guy. I find that just too much. I mean, I can see the academic mileage people will get out of it. And I think photography has become very academic. And I think a lot of the academics are now the tastemakers in a lot of things. I think a lot of photography now, or the trend seems to be, certainly in the so-called art world, is to explain everything. Everything has to be explained. And it gets to the point where the picture it starts losing its power, even losing its worth, because it's all about how you explain it, how you give the context, what's the concept. And I think that's possibly come from the fact that the academics are running the show, and maybe they don't understand photography. Maybe they don't understand the visual process, and they can write about it. So if they can write about it, then they're going to be the ones with the power. I don't know. It's just a little theory, but um, the idea of asking permission for every picture, what does that mean? I mean, what does that mean? I mean, especially in a world where we're being photographed everywhere by either somebody with an iPhone or surveillance cameras or
Cameras.
traffic cameras.
Yeah.
Bloody doorbells have cameras now, and now you got to ask permission for somebody to take a picture. I think it's all about intention. If you're taking photographs to be nasty or to sort of make fun of people, then that's a bad thing. But I think most people taking pictures, if they're sneaking a picture, it's usually because they see something funny or they see something very touching, and they want to capture it. It's the human condition. And if you ask permission, we know what's going to happen. They're going to stand there and smile, and that moment is gone. So, yeah. So that's what I mean by thieving. I don't really mean stealing. And I also don't mean intruding. But
Absolutely.
to make an omelet, you got to break some eggs.
Yeah, that's so true. That's very, very true. Now, I want to just to stay on the topic of photojournalism for now, of course, because I don't want to also reduce you to this, because you've done very different things, and I would love to talk about each and every one of them. I wanted to talk a little bit about Afghanistan, because Afghanistan was not just, at least how I see it, was not just an assignment for you, but kind of like a relationship across the years, going back and forth. So what changed? First of all, the question I want to ask is, what changed in the work once the country stopped being a story but became a long-term presence in your life?
I mean, it was a story the first time I went because it was 94. I'd never been to a war zone. It was a sort of a semi-assignment. The Observer sent me and a writer. The writer had been doing work for the Observer in the past, and it was an assignment, but a lot of it was covered by an NGO because there was no infrastructure whatsoever in Afghanistan at the time. There was only Mujahideen fighting each other, and there was no foreign forces, no peacekeeping forces. The embassies weren't even operating. The representative for the UN was based in Pakistan, and if he had to do something in Afghanistan, he would fly to the airport, not even get out of the plane, meet somebody, and then fly back. That's how dangerous it was and crazy. So that was the first time I'd been to a war zone, and Jesus, did I pick the most incredible place and the most incredible war. But that trip just changed my life, and I found something that I could do, and that really moved me. And I found a country that I just fell in love with, and people that were extraordinary, and people that were suffering, in an unbelievable way. And so that was a real beginning of something. I went back 2 years later when the Taliban took over, and I'd visited a family. I'd stayed with a family. At the very end of the trip, I'd seen so much terrible stuff. I wanted to do something kind of normal, and I found this family, again with the writer David Orr, and we stayed with them, and they were a wonderful family. And 2 years later, I went back when the Taliban were there at the very end of the trip to find them, and they were there. But two of the guys that I'd photographed were killed now by the Taliban, and that started something that every time I went to Afghanistan, I would always go and visit them, and I would take some portraits and then see how they were doing. And I'm still in touch with them. In fact, I'm making a film about them now. So there was this incredible connection with this family, but also the country and what was going on there. And, when I went in 94, it was called the Forgotten War, one of the biggest forgotten wars. When the Taliban came, that focused world attention back on Afghanistan again, because before that it was like, oh, the Russians have left, everything's fine. It wasn't fine. It was much worse than it ever was before. But when the Taliban came, they were kind of funny. They were stringing up television sets and unwinding cassette tapes because it was against their religion, and so the world sort of made fun of them and didn't take them terribly seriously, although they were doing some terrible things. And then they took over, and again, we forgot about Afghanistan because that problem was sorted. We don't have to worry about them. We don't have to do anything. They're just there and they're under control. Well, 9/11 happened, and it happened because they abandoned Afghanistan. So then the world again looked at Afghanistan, and for 20 years then you had the troops there, you had business going in, you had Western governments getting involved. We're back to where it was before. It's been abandoned. So I've seen that history. And also this family, the only members of the family that are still alive are now living in Germany and Turkey. So, and I've been in Afghanistan fairly recently. I keep in touch and I go back. So it was an incredible beginning of something. And then I suppose that led to other conflict zones, and that's where my war photography started. It was Afghanistan. So apart from the first time, which was an assignment, I think as soon as I got there, within the first week, it became something else. It became like a calling almost. It was like a cause in my life. And it also focused what I was doing. Before then, I taught myself photography. I was working in London for various newspapers. I had a very interesting gig with a Swedish newspaper. I used to do all their stuff in England. I was busy. I wasn't traveling that much. I did some things in Ireland, but not much. And then this was the first big foreign trip I did. And this is what I wanted to do. This is what I want to do. This is really what I want to do. And I discovered that through Afghanistan. So very, very quickly after arriving there, it became much more than just a job and a project. It became a calling, as I say.
That's very interesting, because then across all these returns to Afghanistan, what changed more for you? Was it the country, your understanding of it, or the kind of photographer you were inside it?
I think the country doesn't change that much. I think the country is always suffering from outsiders. Pakistan, America, Russia, India, China. They're all doing things to either destabilize Afghanistan or to support certain groups. And there's always interference. And of course, the Afghans, being poor and being sort of looking for outside influences, will play along. And this is how the wars, keep going. And this is how the rivalry is stoked. So, but the way of life in Afghanistan it hasn't changed for probably centuries. I mean, in fact, we talk about, in the 60s you had mini-skirted schoolgirls and you had hippies going through on the hippie trail, which is true. My sister went there. In fact, that was one of the reasons I went to Afghanistan. My eldest sister, went on the hippie trail and raved about Afghanistan and told these incredible stories. I thought, I really want to go to Afghanistan. So when the opportunity came, it happened to be the biggest civil war in the world at the time. I went to Afghanistan. But we have this idea of Afghanistan being, it was very modern in the 60s. It wasn't. I mean, some of the cities, they had some modernity, but in the villages not far from the cities, it was like it was hundreds of years ago, as it still is. Of course, the mobile phones and the internet will be having a huge influence, but ways of life and ways of living. I mean, the family that I'm documenting and I'm still in touch with in Turkey and Germany, they're living lives now in Turkey and Germany that are almost identical to the lives they would be living in Afghanistan. I mean, they are fairly liberal Afghans and they came from Kabul. So
Sure.
it's not like, they were very religious or very kind of dogmatic, but they're hanging out with Afghans. The customs are still continuing. They're still religious. So, the country hasn't changed that much. I've probably changed more than the country in the time that I was going there. Yeah.
Exactly. And what do you think, or maybe what did at the time the international media narrative around Afghanistan fail to see that for you, of course, photography at its best could still hold?
Well, I think they were obsessed. You can understand why, I suppose, with their troops. When I went to Afghanistan, there were no troops. So my work in Afghanistan is all about the Afghans. It's not about British troops or American troops. I went on 2 embeds, I think, because I had to go, because I had to get some imagery of the foreign presence, occupation, but also it was a way to get to certain areas that would have been too dangerous without having the cover of the West. But a lot of photographers, a lot of agencies, all they covered really was Americans, and they would go with the Americans, go on embeds, and then they'd photograph Afghans, as they walk past with American soldiers and American weaponry around them, and yeah, they got pictures of Afghans, but you can imagine under those circumstances, the time you wouldn't have, the access you wouldn't have, and the fear that these people were it was a bit of a funny one. So I was seeing all that, but every time I went to Afghanistan, it was to photograph what the Afghans were going through. And I think the West, you know, Western media were doing what native medias will always do. They're representing stuff that their readers are going to be interested in,
Hmm.
but they didn't really push the boat out enough in terms of showing another country. They were showing the troops, to the folks back home, and I think that was a bit unfortunate. But then, I wasn't alone doing the work I was doing. Lots of photographers were doing the same thing as I was doing. So there is a record of it. There is documentation of it.
Absolutely. There is one photograph from Afghanistan in 1996 of yours in black and white that we also featured in the exhibition we did with Voices for Media Freedom and Journalism, which was, again, a great success. And I want to say again to you as well that the president of the Italian Republic saw the exhibition as well. So that was a very honorable moment for us, and we thank you once again for participating in that. And I have it right here, this photograph of this widow woman sitting on the ground with her child, with all this degrading buildings at the back. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about this moment, because I know the story behind it, and it was a stolen picture in a way, right? In a
There you go.
positive
Yeah.
way. But could you explain this? I want to hear from your
Yeah.
voice.
I mean, it's interesting. I was talking about the family. This was the one opportunity I had to see how the family were doing. And the family lived in all that destruction. The family lived behind that. That that street is called Jadi Maiwand, and it's a thoroughfare. It's like the main thoroughfare of Kabul. It's like Oxford Street of Kabul, or Fifth Avenue of Kabul. And look at it. And they lived in behind the ruins. And what me and the journalist wanted to do was we wanted to find a family living in these ruins. And people told us there's no one living in there. Everyone's left. Or if there's people living in there, they're either mad or they're old and they just can't be bothered leaving. They're just waiting because there was fighting going on all the time and bombing and stuff. And anyway, we did find this family. So I was going back in 96. I'd finished my work and this was the last few days. And we had to stay in this hotel, the Intercontinental, because that's what the Taliban told you. You had to stay in that hotel and they would keep an eye on you. And if you went anywhere, they would send somebody with you. Well, we were able to, on that street, we were able to, we walked along and then we saw that woman and then we decided, and we wanted to turn back. And then as we turned back, that's when I took that photograph. And then the idea was we were going to go in where the rubble was and then lose the Taliban minder, which is what we did. And then we went to the family. We got word to the family through somebody. And they said, don't meet us at the house because it's dangerous for everybody. Just meet us. And they told us where to meet them. And I photographed them on the roof of this building, 3 or 4 frames. And then I didn't see them for 5 years after that.
Wow.
But that picture was, yeah, it was walking down the street and then seeing that woman. And I said to Anthony, the guy I was with, let's just go back now. And I went back. And as we turned back, I had the camera at my waist and I just coughed and took some frames. 2 frames, I think. It's 2 frames in the end. And that was that. And it was incredible because that woman was, yeah, as you say, she was a widow. Women weren't allowed to work. They weren't even really supposed to go out, but she had to go out. She had to beg. I mean, and there was nobody around. You could see how deserted that is. I mean, that woman is begging, but maybe she's hoping the Taliban might give her some bread or something. Yeah, I suppose she'll have more chance of being fed if she's outside than she is if she's at home. Chilling, really chilling.
There is this very apocalyptic architecture in this photograph as well. You see her begging under Taliban surveillance. This photograph, it very much feels like both a historical document and an act of resistance, also from your side, in a way, because you risked your life, if I can say that, to take this photograph.
Probably not my life, but it would have been very unpleasant what would have
Yeah,
happened. Yeah.
exactly. Bearing
Yeah.
witness, to the social
Yeah.
consequences
Yeah.
of a
Sure.
regime found on domination on any kind of thing, not just women.
Absolutely. But you can go further than that too. Like, who are the Taliban? Who created the Taliban? Well, the West, in many ways, created the Taliban. And they, because the Taliban came out of the Mujahideen who fought the Russians. So the Russians invaded Afghanistan. The Russians actually reluctantly invaded Afghanistan. From the history that I've read, they reluctantly, they knew that it was going to be a difficult thing, but they were enticed in by some communist leaders, Afghan leaders, who were trying to kill each other. The two leaders were trying to kill each other. In fact, when the Russians came in, the first thing they did was they killed one of those leaders because they thought this guy was the bad guy. Very bloody history. But, so once they came in, the Cold War started happening in Afghanistan, and the West, America, saw an opportunity to, obviously they didn't want the Soviets overrunning a whole piece of land there. And so they started funding heavily, billions of dollars in weapons to the Mujahideen. And that created this huge stockpile of weapons, plus all these fighters, plus a civil war that killed more people than the Russians ever killed. And then out of that, the Taliban was a faction that felt that the Mujahideen were far too corrupt and had lost religion. And that's where the Taliban came from. So you could say, in a way, the funding of American weaponry to fight the Russians in Afghanistan is a large part played a large part in the creation of the Taliban. Pakistan were also involved. So that, you can look at that picture and say, absolutely. But, the Taliban weren't responsible for the damage around that.
Sure.
That was actually the civil war. That was the Mujahideen fighting each other. That was Afghans fighting Afghans. It wasn't the Russians who did that damage. So a picture like that can really open up so many avenues of discussion and history. And then, who knows, that picture might have been even used by America to justify going into Afghanistan in 2001. We have to go and liberate the women.
Yeah.
They're not doing much about the women now, are they?
Are
That
they?
was
Exactly.
completely forgotten. That was completely
Exactly.
forgotten.
I have
So
one last question on Afghanistan, and then we'll move to something different. When a place has been so much, pass me the term, over photographed through the lens of war, how do you keep seeing beyond the dominant narrative, the dominant structure of a situation?
I think it's like anywhere really, any photography. I mean, I was talking about Kolkata and India, like that's probably the most photographed place on earth. I mean, everyone's done it and everyone's done it really well. They've become sort of cliched now, images of the river and people washing in the river and the beggars and the poverty and then the other side of it, the food and the wonderful, I mean, life and the intellectual side of the Bengalis, all that. But it's all been done, and I really struggled. I really struggled to try and work in a way that I thought was original and was adding something to the mix. So it's very tricky. But I think in a war zone, again, what I was saying earlier on, that there are certain things you do because you're gathering information and you are responding to what's happening. You're not starting each day thinking, now what am I going to photograph today? Because actually, it's sort of almost handed to you. The situation's handed to you, and how you respond to it is different. So I think that's you respond to the situation, and the situation may be very difficult to get to somewhere or to decide how long to stay. Maybe it's very dangerous. So maybe you've got like 5 minutes. You've traveled all day or even for days to get somewhere, and you've got 5 minutes to do something. What do you get out of that situation? But that's the breaks. That's what happens.
Yes. No, this is truly, truly interesting. Now, moving away from war zones and everything, I've noticed, like, I feel your work feels very precise, but never fully closed. So it's in a way, you give us information, but you leave a little bit room for ambiguity. At least this is how I tend to see your
Yeah, because I'm not sure. I don't have a clue what's going on most of the times. You know, um,
exactly. So
I'm responding.
why
Sorry, go ahead.
is that ambiguity important to you?
I think it's unconscious. I think it's I think it's funny actually. Like yesterday, there's somebody, Zelda Cheetle is a great friend of mine. She's a fantastic curator, and she's curating this show in India. And there was this picture I really wanted to include, and it's of this flower. It's on a bicycle. It's this flower, and it's incredibly abundant and luxurious, and the light is lovely and everything. But she hadn't chosen. I said, "That's really, I mean, it could almost be the, a poster for the show." And she said, "Yeah, I know, but it's just there's a plastic bag on the handlebars." And I was like, "That's not the point, but that's so part of the picture." And she said, "Yeah, yeah, I know, but," and her reasons were very valid. That this is India, and people want to see it a certain way, and I mean, I think she's very experienced in prints and galleries and what works on a wall. So, but anyway, we had a discussion, and it's going to be in, and she wanted it to be in. Um, but yeah. Sorry, what was what was the question again? Just thinking of that
Ambigu-
flower.
yes, I also got lost. No, what does ambiguity mean to you? Why is that ambiguity important in
Yeah,
your photography?
because I think it's because you're not consciously, when you take a photograph. I think when you, especially a photograph that's happening very fast, you're responding to a situation that's not going to be around for a long time. You might have 2 seconds. You're doing it on instinct, and you're framing it on instinct. Um, so you don't quite know what it is that's got you so excited. That's got you to sort of have to take that picture. It's funny, and you see it later, and you say, "Oh yeah, well, but the intellect hasn't sort of reached the instinct yet. I mean, there's a kind of a slow, in my case anyway, there's a slow kind of slow journey. So there's ambiguity even in taking the photograph. You're responding to a stimulus. Maybe it's a shape, maybe it's a shadow you saw, and you turn around and, oh, you have to do it, but you're not really sure what it is you're photographing. You're not sure what you're trying to say. A lot of it happens afterwards when you look at the picture and you put other pictures together and you say, well, yeah, this actually corresponds to the way I was feeling that day, or the way I feel about that place, or the way I think about something, and so it's not just the act of taking the picture, you're not just walking out saying, I feel this way, bang, there it is, I've done it. It's very organic, and it's very ongoing, and sometimes you don't know what you got until you got a lot of it. And then you look at it together, and then the theme becomes obvious. But maybe you didn't quite recognize it as an unconscious thing. I don't know, but there's a lot of mystery to this. And what I was saying earlier on about photography getting harder as you get older, I think that's what I was talking about too.
Hmm.
So the ambiguity also is something visual that makes you question, and maybe doesn't make it so obvious, and you've got to sort of work a little bit hard. I love that. So maybe that's what I'm trying to also incorporate.
Because you often deal with very real political conditions, but your images, again, as you said, also carry this mystery, this atmosphere, this silence, we could say,
Mm. Mm.
perhaps. Do you ever worry that ambiguity could be misread?
Yeah, that's the point. Ambiguity. Ambiguity, yeah, it can be read one way or another. I mean, that's the point. It's open-ended. I mean, I'm not taking sides, you know. I'm
Yes,
not
that's the
taking
point.
sides. I mean, I know there's a huge movement now and a feeling of solidarity, which, I feel solid with many causes, and I believe in many things. But I don't think, as a photographer, I mean, I'm saying that, but of course, if something's happening in front of my eyes, and by taking that picture, you're making a very obvious point. I'm not going to not take it. I'm not. Oh, it's not ambiguous enough. That's not what I'm saying. But just naturally, how I operate is I try to have a bit of mystery. I'm not trying to confuse. I'm not trying to blur, anything. And in fact, usually the situations I'm in are very real, as you say, and also very prosaic. They're usually very unpoetic places. And I try to sort of make something not pretty, but something with a bit of depth. Oh, there's a cat. Did you hear that?
So
Yeah.
cute. I'm a
Yeah.
cat girl. Love it.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Okay. That's it. Walk on part. So it's not a deliberate sort of foggy, blurring of what's happening. But it's also, you're trying to entice someone who's looking at the picture to stay and dwell on the picture, like the picture of picture of the begging woman. You know, had I been closer, I might have got the burqa. But and obviously that circumstance was wasn't the easiest. So the ambiguity is always there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I always feel torn in a way within the field, within documentary photography about suggesting and explaining. I don't know. I feel torn again, so I'm asking you as well. So, would you trust suggestions more than explanations with all we have said so far, in the sense of not taking stances, not explaining too much?
I mean, I think I think I think both of. I mean, I think obviously in a way maybe it's. I was going to say it's more honest to be more obvious, but then is it? Because you're just sort of presenting something either you think or you think people would like
Exactly.
would like to see, and it's sort of I think I was beginning to say something about there's a lot of people now who are taking protest pictures or and that's fine. They believe in the cause, and it's very good to document those protests. But it's people holding banners, and the words say what the picture means. I know it goes beyond that because it's a moment in time, and there's passion in the picture, and there's maybe something else going on in the picture. I'm not trying to sort of say anything bad about those pictures, but they're very obvious. They're very obvious. There's no ambiguity. And would you say that's more honest? You might, but you might not. You might say the opposite. In fact, you might say that they're not really giving you the full picture. They're giving you what they think is the truth, and that's fine. They've got every right to do that, but it's just not my way. But it's funny. I was about to say, well, it's probably more honest if you're less ambiguous. Not sure it is. Certainly for me, I'd
Exactly.
have to be ambiguous to be honest, because I'm the first person to say I haven't got a clue what's going on here, but I want to find out. And I think a picture that's ambiguous might draw you in, and as I say, spend a bit more time on the frame and thinking about what's going on and what that means and how did this happen and why is that woman begging and why are those buildings so destroyed and why is the photographer so far away from her and where else are the people on the street? All those things become far more important than just the woman begging.
See, ambiguity, I feel like it's not the only aspect of your photography that it's visible, but you also have this kind of openness to absurdity, if I can say that.
I love absurdity. Yeah.
And there is a thing that you once said that really struck me. That was that even places as different as Ireland and Afghanistan can share a certain relationship to the absurd. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think especially those two places. That's why I'm so at home in Afghanistan, because I mean life is absurd. Let's face it. If you were trying to explain to somebody what life is like on Earth, yeah, it's a funny one. And the Irish, I think, because of their history and because of I don't know, Celtic blood or something, they embrace the absurdity and they make fun of it and they make poetry out of it and they dance on the grave. It's that attitude, and I think the Afghans are very similar, very similar. They also like slapstick. It's very funny if you're in Afghanistan and somebody's cycling past you and they fall into a puddle, the street will just crease in laughter. I mean, just everyone slapping their, oh, it's not hilarious. I fell off a horse in 2000 and my biggest fear was the cameras were broken, and I was lying there. The horse reared up and I was lying there and all these people came around to look after me, but they couldn't stop laughing. And I was lying there, I thought my back was broken. And all I could see were these giggling, and that would happen in Ireland. And that's just being tickled by life. You have to be.
Now I want to dive a little bit more into something that it's more related to books, editing, sequences, your approach to this kind of technicalities in a way. And I wanted to ask you, how would you describe the visual qualities you actually care about in a picture?
I think it's got to be dynamic. And that can be a still frame, that can be a still life. But there's got to be something going on in it that I mean, you were saying about silence. I think that's very true. Even if it's a crowded
Yes,
crowded,
exactly.
a crowd of people. The silence will be that moment that there's something. It's not just the frozen moment, which is very important, but it's also there's a connection with people or there's a connection with life. And it could be the flower on the handlebars of the bike. There's a mystery to it. I mean, it's very hard to describe this. But I think a picture has to have that. It can't be just, okay, here's a portrait of, somebody. There's gonna be something to it, and that's the role of the photographer. And it's a hard one. Every time you try and take a picture, it's a challenge, and so I think, it's not just a straightforward thing of snap, obviously. So it's got to have dynamism in that way. Could be in the look of someone in a portrait. It could be just the look. So dynamism, I think visually interesting, so that you're looking around the frame and I don't mean you're seeing things in the background, but just the way it's been constructed and the shapes. I'm so into shapes. Often I think shapes are the things that is the first response, that stimulus that makes you take a picture. You see something and it's a shape. You've probably already seen what that thing was, because the mind is so extraordinary, and the eyes are seeing things you've forgotten about already. But you might already have stored what it is, and then there's something happens. It's a shape or a shadow that happens, and you respond to it because maybe you anticipate it in some way. I don't know, but and that comes across in a picture when you get that thing of, there's something incredibly perfect about that moment, and you don't know what it is.
What is your relationship instead to post production? Do you see it as correction, refinement, translation, interference?
Usually it's to clean things up a bit. That's what I don't, I mean, it's interesting now shooting digital, which I'm doing with color, where you're shooting raw. And it's almost like you could shoot almost any exposure and you'll get a usable picture. Before, I think you had to be more conscious of light, and because of that, you were using light more than you do now. And so that's something with post-production. I don't want to sort of open up shadows so much that it's just all very clear. I do like shadows, and I like things falling into shadows. And with RAW, you can make everything visible. And I think you start seeing pictures. You see these pictures that it's almost like looking at an airbrush of something. It's not real, because actually when the eye is looking at something and there's light and shade, the iris of the eye will open and the shadow will go into shadow. It's like focus, it's the same thing. It's like the eye. So I think naturally, um, I don't want the pictures to look unnatural. No. I mean, digital is amazing to be able to shoot at low light at night. All that stuff is great, but the other side of that is it can do too much. And I think post production is to try and maintain limits.
In places like the one you've been, I feel like equipment stops being a fetish, if I can say that, and becomes a survival decision. What do you actually need, and what do you deliberately leave behind?
If it's somewhere that there's a lot of traveling, I would limit the equipment. Always have two cameras, obviously. Probably not bring so many long lenses, because your long lenses are very important at times, extremely important at times, but most of the time it's, we're talking between 35 and 85. That's the range. So you can very much limit, the lenses that you're going to need to carry. That first trip to Afghanistan, I had Canon film cameras, fairly new, and there was a fault in that there was a um, there was a screw at the back of the lens that when you put it on the camera, for some reason this screw came loose, so it was sticking out. And what it did was when you put it on the camera, I had two camera bodies. When you put it on the camera and put it on, it sliced the connection between the camera and the lens. So immediately the focus was gone, so it was only manual focus, and everything was wide open. And I said, shit, and I took off the lens and I put the lens on the other camera. I did the same thing. So the two cameras were all shooting wide open. So that was either 2.8 or 1.8, everything. everything. But I brought an SLR, fully manual Nikon, and I ended up doing a lot of pictures on that with a 28 and a 50. And it sort of taught me a lesson that, you know, you don't need that much equipment, but you need backups. And then obviously these days you have to have computers.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, it adds up. But yeah,
Your work is also emotionally intense, but it never really feels visually hysterical, if I can say that, which some photographs from some photojournalists sometimes have this feeling. How do you decide what kind of images belongs in a story and what kind of images is perhaps too easy, too spectacular, too obvious?
I think it's taste, isn't it? It's just taste in the end. I think if something is extreme and it's happening, and sometimes it works, but I think to try and go for that all the time, go for the sensation, I think that's a real mistake. And it becomes tiring after a while to see these pictures. And again, it's like you get it in a second and then you move on. It's not really interesting. You're not going to dwell on that picture for very long. You see whatever it is, and yeah, okay, there's not much depth to it. So subtlety, I love subtlety. I mean, you can be too subtle sometimes and people don't get it. And that is a danger. But I'd rather be too subtle than too sensational.
Sure.
Because someone might then give it more time to try and work out, like, well, this is so boring. What's he trying to say? And then maybe they'll discover it.
That's very interesting. Now I want to instead dive a little bit into documentary photography today, more in general, like the faults and the problems the genre is facing. So for you, what do you think are the real fault lines of documentary photography today?
Funding is a big one.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of documentary photography, say up to about 20 years ago, a lot of it, if you look at archives and look at the great work that we look on now as the history of photography, a lot of it was paid for by media, for newspapers and magazines. And, it's just very obvious now that so much of that is just not there anymore. So huge amounts of things aren't being covered in the way they were. Okay, a lot of it was biased. A lot of it was Fleet Street. If it was London, it had a sort of British angle. But even so, it had great value and also some amazing work. That's not there anymore. So that's a huge change. And then what happens is, I suppose, documentary that's funded will be funded by certain types of institutions, organizations with their own agendas. So in a way, you could say they're biased in a way, but there's just a lot less money. And there's a lot less money being spread around. And again, with the technology, you could say, well, everyone's got cameras, everyone can document. Yes, but what are they documenting and how are they preserving the work? And is it any good? Is it interesting? Is it too biased? It's fine
Absolutely.
that, yeah. So I think that would be one. Obviously, the AI business is a huge danger. Nobody knows where that's going to go. It might be something, although I'm not that optimistic, that makes people want more authenticity. My fear is that with a lot of things, when people get used to something and they're not paying for it or it's very cheap, they don't question it. It continues, no matter how bad it is, no matter how fake it is. I'm in fear that will set in. And we're all so obsessed with our phones. We give away so much of our own identities and freedom to these things because of the convenience. Um,
But yeah,
and politically, what's happened in the world because of the smartphone is phenomenal.
it is.
That people can be messaged and attacked through their personal phone. You are totally vulnerable all the time to these messages. And people know that. A lot of people know that, and yet they still have a phone. I still have a phone. So my fear is that AI is going to creep in, and it'll become the norm. And we just live with it. We just live with it. I think like a lot of people, you start out saying, "Oh, I'd never do that," I'd never go on Facebook, or and then as time, as time goes by, you succumb to it and you end up doing it, even if it's limited and, it's still, it's still normalizing it.
It's true. It's true because I feel like documentary photography with AI generated imagery in the background of everything now either would become more valuable or more vulnerable.
Mm,
I don't know.
mm,
I don't have an answer
mm.
to that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
We'll see.
yeah, when you think when you think about sort of the industry, if you want to call it that, the industry will often usually go the way of what's cheapest, what makes money. And that's my fear, is that, it becomes normal, people get used to it, and then they don't yearn for, maybe a small section of society demands authenticity, but who's supporting that?
Yeah.
Who's supporting that? I mean,
Also.
yeah, yeah, it's fearful.
And what kind of documentary work do you distrust immediately, even if it looks good? Would you distrust immediately, even if it looks good? Is there something that for you cannot cross the line in a way?
Well, I think these sort of very PR driven documentaries of famous people, they're pretty obnoxious. Paid for by them. I mean, like, so obviously it's a bit like these reviews that people do online of restaurants. I mean, of course, the restaurant owner is going to tell all his relatives and friends to say nice things. I mean, it's not very objective. So, and my fear is that that creeps in more. I think with the money in streaming and the audiences wanting them, and that could creep into, beyond celebrity and famous people, but normal documentaries becoming like, people need stories that are easy to digest, and I think a lot of documentaries, some documentaries can be constructed that way, and sort of written that way and structured, and that would be a fear, that things become a bit more consumer friendly. The
Consumer
documentary should
friendly.
be it should be challenging. It should be
Yeah.
attacking. It should be questioning. It's not there to make you feel good.
Yeah. Uncomfortable. It has to make you
Yeah,
feel
yeah,
uncomfortable.
yeah.
Absolutely. Do you think in today's time, is it still realistically possible to make a living out of photography without constantly fragmenting yourself and your work or have your work diluted across, I don't know, commissions, teachings, books, and everything? Do you think for a young photographer starting now, is it still possible to make a living out of documentary photography?
I think it is, but it's very rare. And I think, actually, even in the times that I talked about that were good, and I caught the very end of the good times, I suppose, it was still a struggle, but there was work. But it wasn't so easy, but there was work. Now I think it's very, very difficult. And any young photographers ask, what I always say: grab what you can. If you can teach, if there's anything else you can do that allows you to work, gives you enough time to work, but pays the rent, whatever, grab it.
Do it.
To just be a photographer now, I think it's very, very hard. Some people can do it. The lucky ones maybe have very good clients, work for
Mm.
very good people, but it's very, very rare. You know, if before it was 100, now it's maybe one or two. I mean, really, it's maybe even less, maybe even less. Somebody was telling me that, I think it was when I think it was the Bhopal tragedy in India. You know, Time magazine sent 5 photographers to cover it. Newsweek sent the same. All these magazines sent, had, so that some big world event, death of a pope or whatever, they would have all these, each organization would have, so that was all that work, all those jobs. And then all those people were shooting film. And so that film had to be processed. The film had to be, it multiplies over so much, and that's just wiped out. You take pictures now, and I take pictures now in digital, and I have to do all the post-production myself,
And
and,
sending
and
is
yeah, so it's not just even the photographer that's out of pocket. The printers, the darkroom people that sell film. Um, so very difficult, but grab what you can to make a living.
Exactly. Also connecting to what you just said right now, I feel like the market is very much now rewarding speed, self-positioning more than depth and long-term commitment in that
But I think we
sense.
we live in the age of boasts, don't we? It's, well, everything's boasting. You have to boast. You have to go on Instagram and say, "I'm so honored that they gave me this picture," and then you give this huge blurb about, who to thank. You're thanking people that gave you the job. I mean, that's very nice, but they gave you the job because presumably you're good enough to do the job. They're being paid to give you the job. Do you really have to thank them? I'm not being nasty, but it's too much.
It is too
But
much.
it's all in the work of putting that photographer, I mean, that's how desperate things are, that people have to do all this stuff to maintain contacts. And it's expected. And if you don't do it, then people think you're rude. So it's a funny old world
It
right
is
now.
a funny word. And do you think the biggest challenge today is making strong work, getting it seen, building an economic structure for yourself? What is the biggest challenge?
Economic. I
Economic,
think,
right?
yeah, because
Yeah.
you can get the work out there, okay, maybe it is Instagram, maybe it is, but there are opportunities to do things now. It might be very diluted and maybe sort of many, many platforms, but because in the old days it was like, you did work and then you had to get it published in the magazines or newspapers. And if they didn't want them, that was the end of it. That was the end of it. Okay, you could put up an exhibition, but that was kind of rare and very expensive. And printing was darkroom printing, etc. Now everything's cheaper. I mean, there are huge advantages to the digital revolution, but the money to support it all is the biggest
Biggest
challenge.
challenge.
Yeah.
If you were starting again today with no reputation at all, do you think you could build the same kind of career? And what would you do differently compared to your actual beginnings?
I think it would be possible, but I think because that must be what every photography student faces, or every person that wants to get into photography faces. They're not known; they have to build themselves up. I think the amount of PR they have to do with social media, with networking, is huge, so much more. In my day, you'd call up a picture desk and try and go and see the picture editor or the deputy picture editor, and you'd show the work, and that was how you did it. Now, you can put it out there and people will see it, and you have to be very good at social media. You have to be very good at boasting. You really do have to be good at boasting. Otherwise, you're going to remain unknown. It's the loudest that gets noticed, much more so now than ever before. And it's, what do they call it? Virtue signaling, all that shit, all that stuff. Unfortunately, I guess, is what it takes now to be a successful photographer. So I wouldn't be very good at that. So I probably would have done something else, like driven a taxi or something. I don't know.
Completely
Some honest,
different.
some honest work.
I love that. I love that. Is there something in your practice that you have had to unlearn over the years?
Yeah. I mean, I think this thing I was saying about, going to America and not doing what I would have done for magazines, thinking too much about the literal, you know, almost thinking in headlines. I think I had to, I'm trying to stop that because it's so ingrained. And I think it goes back to the thing we're talking about, academics and the intellectual side of things. I think the intellectual side of things is really important when it comes to photography, but it's sort of before and after. It's not during, when you're taking pictures, when you're doing work. It's not really about the intellect. You're not really engaging the intellect. It's a very physical activity. Before, yes, you think about what you want to do and think about projects, and after, very much so, putting it together and sequencing it and drawing out the themes and you know sharpening it and all that stuff. I think it's that thing of being too literal and being not visual. The visual it's its own language, and I think we obviously we operate it with words all the time. We communicate with words, but it's trying to tap into that visual thing. And I'm trying to get back to that amateur photographer I was back in San Francisco. Um, that is like it's a very free state, and it's hard. It's hard to unlearn things. Yeah, I think that's probably what I'm trying to unlearn all the time.
And is there anything you believe strongly about photography 20 years ago, for instance, that you no longer believe now?
I was going to say cropping. I was always very, I didn't want to crop a picture. Um, and now I'm okay with it. I always feel, sorry, I always feel I'm doing something naughty by cropping it because, it's not really the photograph I took. But the interesting thing is, what we are saying about instinct and responding to shapes. I'll look at a picture often and think, maybe this could be slightly altered. And then 9 times out of 10 or 8 times out of 10, I'll go back to the original. I'll go back to the original frame and find that actually, leaving it the way it was better. But that's something that I think, when I was shooting black and white film and printing it myself and printing the border around the picture, it was very dogmatic. It had to be the picture. That was the picture I took, and that proves it. I'm not faking it. And now, I guess it's on a screen and whatever else. I'm not so traumatized by cropping a picture. Anything else?
Interesting.
Shooting color, no. I mean, I always shot color. That it wasn't such a religious thing to shoot black and white. I think just cropping, yeah, which I'm sort of okay with. I mean, I wouldn't like it to become a
I think.
practice that I was doing it all the time and every picture was croppable because but it's just rarely I do it, but I do it and I don't mind doing it.
Okay. And what do you think a photograph cannot do, no matter how powerful it is?
Nothing really. I don't think anything. No, I mean it's got its. I was going to say audio, but it's got its own voice. And often that voice is far more powerful than this film I'm going to be making with the family. A lot of it's going to be relying on my black and white archive going back to '94, and then all those years, and just putting that stuff together with video. The video is great, and it's all the information's there, and you can get very touching moments. But then you go to this still picture, and it's speaking to you in such a way. And again, you were saying the silence. The silence is deafening. I don't think there's much I don't think there's anything that the still picture can't do.
I love this.
I
Yes.
mean, of course, it can't stop wars, but it can change attitudes.
That's the thing. Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Love that. And after all these years, Seamus, of shooting, photographing, seeing the world, and meeting people, anything, what still makes you pull up the camera and shoot?
Excitement. I mean, I'm just still excited by the prospect of getting that image. And I don't know what the image is. I won't. I don't know until I get it. And there's just something that just never really. It never tarnishes. And then I bring my camera for a walk. That's it. You go out with the camera and you meet the world, and it's been said many times. It's such a passport into people's lives, and um, I'm a curious person, and it gives me such license to explore things. So there's that side of it, but the bottom line is the image for me. The image is not that the image is all, but it's the thing that most motivates me to do it, to continue. And it is that thing of I wrote somewhere I did some interview and I said there's an inevitability to a great picture. Like once you've taken that picture, you look at it and you think, yeah, well, of course, it was waiting for me. I mean, it was always going to be taken. It was just like a question of when. I don't know where that feeling comes from, but it's there. And as soon as I've got the picture, and sometimes you've got a great picture, sometimes you don't know until later, but sometimes when you're taking the picture, you take the picture and it's like a relief. Oh, I found it. Of course, it was inevitable. It was going, it was going to happen.
I love this. Seamus, I'm actually done. And
Okay.
I honestly thank you so much for the conversation we had. I hope you felt comfortable as much as I
Yes,
did
very comfortable
personally.
and
Great.
lovely to sort of draw this stuff out of me because it's stuff that's deep down and obviously there, but it's not something you talk about every day. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I really much appreciate it. I've always looked up to photographers like yourself, and it's such a pleasure again to have met
Thank
you.
you.
And I hope to see you in person one day,
Yes,
or
let's hope so. Let's hope so.
yeah, somewhere. And for everybody who's watching again, please keep liking and keep subscribing to keep having exclusive and supportive street and documentary photography content. Seamus, again, thank you so much and
Thank
see
you.
you soon.
Bye bye.